So for those of you who haven't used Zoom before, I have wine in this cup and I'm going to blow on it occasionally to make it look like it's coffee. If you hover your mouse on the page or your cursor, you'll see the chat bar and the Q&A. We're going to put everything in the chat room tonight. We have lots of questions already, but by all means, if you want to ask some questions, we're probably never going to get another eminently qualified politician with so much background on technology as well. And also with Dr. Chris Jones, the new AEVA president. There's a lot of knowledge in the room. I'm the poor cousin. I have to thank the coordinators. Here we are, as I just mentioned, year 49 of the AEVA, the oldest electric vehicle association in the world. And it's not just cars, of course, ladies and gentlemen. You can see the buses, the trains, the scooters, the bikes. We have to thank the coordinators because it's taken a lot of work, especially Senator Rex Patrick's staff. We're being recorded and we will share it. So do please be civil in the topic and the chat. Have a look at the www.aeva.asn.au site. You'll see some other policy addresses come on. The one that I'm most excited about is Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute. He's one of Australia's leading economists. He's going to pass comment on what we hear almost on a daily basis. And given that policy typically costs us taxpayers money, the economics simply must stack up. The sessions, of course, tonight and coming up are provided by the association. And we welcome you all tonight. I'm here on Palawa land here in Tasmania, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and their past and emerging leaders. I think it's such a joy to be in Tasmania with Chris in Western Australia and Senator Rex Patrick also in South Australia, and it shows the technology has come a long way. Just got a little note that my internet was unstable, and I'm just thinking, let's not mention infrastructure tonight. And I got 50 meg up and 17 down. Ladies and gentlemen, it makes me very arrogant. Oh, no, sorry, not arrogant, proud to say my home state is now 100% renewable, and it has been for 7 years. But I'm embarrassed to admit that it took 50 plus years to get there. And it was a result of a man's vision many, many years ago, and it was done with hydro and dams. It only took South Australia 5 years to get to 110%, and duly they rubbed their success in our noses to prove what can be done with a big battery and a focused population. As always, Vic is just behind them. So how did that happen? What policy and what vision drove this, ladies and gentlemen? And I think that we're very privileged to have a senator from South Australia who was going to deliver that keynote address in South Australia. Nick Xenophon called him Inspector Rex. However, given the release of the Bureau forecast and the government tried to bury it, I'm calling him the Truth Whisperer. Whether it is about noisy submarines, the Murray-Darling, freedom of speech, policy debate, Australian intelligence matters, calling out fossil fuel tax dodgers, our position with China, ladies and gentlemen, he's technical, he's reasonable, he's personable and fact-driven. To please welcome him, ladies and gentlemen, to address our ambitions, our incentives and our infrastructure. Please welcome Senator Rex Patrick.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me as a first point.
Yes, we can.
Yep, okay, that's great. So I've just arrived back from Cooper P. So we can pretend we were really organised and that we had this sort of lined up half an hour ago and everything was good, but that's not the case. Look, thank you very much to the Australian Electric Vehicle Association for inviting me along to do this. I'm going to talk about kind of three topic areas: ambition, incentive, and infrastructure. I'm going to start off with a little bit of history, however. Now, my first exposure to an electric vehicle goes back 40 years. The vehicle I'm talking about had a 440 volt battery. It could deliver 7,400 ampere hours at the 5-hour discharge rate to 2,200 kilowatt motors, electric motors. Now, if you haven't worked out what I'm talking about an Oberon class submarine, which I served on. So I'd just like to think that in amongst this audience, I'm probably ahead of most of you in terms of interaction with electric vehicles. But moving forward, we need to be realistic. The nature of transport is changing. Electric vehicles aren't pie in the sky. Anyone who thinks that is the case is just not reading things very well. And we have had sort of disappointing moments from politicians over the last few years, in effect in denial. I sometimes talk to people who say, look, Rex, we can't pick winners. We don't have to pick winners because, by and large, the car companies have already stated that they are moving away from internal combustion engine. It's a case of we're going to be left out if we don't take the task on with vigour. So when I look at things, I have a technical background. I'm an electronic technician. I worked in the engineering world for many years, including as a project manager. Before you can sort of talk about solutions, you've got to start with what is the problem and understanding the problem. And that's generally how I've taken on these tasks. Now that doesn't mean you get a consultant to do lots and lots of papers. It means getting out in amongst the stakeholders, people that are doing the work, and understanding where things are at. And I've been trying to do that in my role as a senator for South Australia for some time now. I really probably got my teeth into electric vehicles when the Senate conducted a select committee inquiry into electric vehicles, and that I can highly recommend to anyone listening or watching. Is still a seminal piece of work that I encourage everyone to read. Now, just in relation to ambition, 4 layers to ambition. There's individuals, there's businesses, there's industry, and there's government. And I think it's fair to say that in amongst individuals, businesses, and industry, that they've got the ambition. They're actually doing stuff already. It's government where we probably have some problems, and we need to break that down into 3 levels. Of course, we've got the local governments, state governments, and the federal government, and each have to play their own part in this space. In the federal space, look, there hasn't been a lot. We have just seen recently an announcement of $250 million for charging infrastructure, and I welcome that. But I don't think the government has been sending the right signals, and it does end up inhibiting the way in which we look at things, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. The problem we've got at the moment is the individuals, the businesses, and industry are kind of working in isolation. They're not approaching this problem in a coherent and integrated way because there's actually no bigger vision. There's no vision that's been laid out on the table by the federal government. So here's my political dig. Not planning is lazy and allows the government to escape from objective assessment as to their own performance. If they had laid out a plan, we could then have looked at the milestones along the way and said, are you doing enough? And they simply haven't done that. I don't think a nation should, like Australia, should sit back and just say, let's let the market decide. I don't think that works. This is the transition away from ICEs is bigger than people just moving to electric cars. As was mentioned before, scooters, town buses, intercity buses. There's light commercial vehicles. We've got long haul trucks, BW doubles, road trains, and of course trains as well. So there's quite a big spread there, and they're not just the end of the line as well. We've got to have an ecosystem that actually supports all of those vehicles and has them integrating into, for example, our electricity system, because we know they are an energy storage device as well, and there is a place for them to be integrated. But of course, that all has to be planned. It can't simply happen by accident, and you can't just let the market run to its own agenda. The other thing I would put is that we need to have an onshore EV industry, and I think the federal government have a huge role to play in that space. I think pretty much every level of government would say, look, we'd love to have electric vehicle manufacturing in our state, just as long as they don't have to do anything serious to get it to happen. And that's the unfortunate thing. So we've got the industry, we've got the ambition. They're off designing, developing electric cars, developing their product ranges, but there's a whole range of absence in them doing so, in terms of things like, just simple things like regulations, not keeping up. And we've got to remember that most of these companies that are developing these vehicles are foreign-owned companies. They've got no patriotism where they say we're going to develop a capability in Australia. They have to be guided. They have to be drawn into the Australian environment, and that takes effort from government. So that's an important part of this. There doesn't appear to be the local ambition necessary to try and drag industry to Australia, to encourage them to come here, to encourage them to set up. What about some of those Australian things we would like? Off-road vehicles and utes, long-haul trucks, farm machines, things that might be very, very Australian. We're kind of missing out on some of these things. Just moving to incentives. So that's talking about ambition, moving to incentives. Now, it's easy to call for a whole range of incentives, reduced or no stamp duty, no road user charges, and so forth. Now, probably at the federal level, road user charges probably need to be coordinated in that we cross state boundaries where we might find things like registration and so forth. They become very much state issues. So we've got to recognise that different tiers of government will have different impacts on things. But there are things that we can see happen at the federal level, encouraging infrastructure rollouts, establishing an industry base, and using the purchasing power of government to send strong messages. Again, the federal government hasn't done well in that space. Some of the state governments are doing a lot better, and local councils. There's other things like, one of the things that frustrates me here in Australia is that we don't do a lot of value add. Now, I can talk more generally about iron ore just getting shipped off to Asia and other places where they do all of the steel manufacturing, they do all the value add. Well, it's the same with lithium. We've got a lot of lithium, a significant part of percentage of the world deposits up in places like the Pilbara. And what do? We dig it out of the ground and we send it to China. In fact, I was at a Senate inquiry the other day where we were talking about titanium being ripped out of the ground at $300 a tonne, and then we have to buy titanium powder back at $300,000 a tonne. All the values being done overseas. So we can actually integrate moving forward with electric vehicles with things like producing lithium batteries. Let's stop exporting lithium and start exporting lithium batteries. All of those sorts of things ought to be in place. Unfortunately, we don't have a federal government that thinks in that space, picking out areas where we've got competitive advantage because the resources are here, and then growing an industry where we develop IP, where we employ people, where we value add, where we have companies that return taxes to the Australian public, as opposed to just having all of this activity take place overseas. Legislation is another thing where we could, for example, force tighter fuel qualities or tighten emission standards in relation to electric ICE vehicles. That can also have the effect of driving people towards electric vehicles. Tax incentives, subsidies, grants, or investments should all be given or framed up in the bigger plan. If we had that bigger plan. Obviously, state governments can do things like having reduced stamp duties, lower registration costs. They need to be providing guidance on how to connect into the grid, to how to have the vehicle become part of the state's energy system. We have to deal with those changes in the power networks, making sure that we plan in for things like electric vehicles. And sadly, I don't think a lot of this is happening. So I think road user charges are short-sighted and a near-term grab for cash. It's no accident, in my view. As I was watching us come out of COVID, governments had spent a lot of money on supporting businesses, supporting individuals throughout the pandemic. We got to the other side of that, and you can see state governments going, "Geez, where do I get money from? How do I bring in money?" And so there has been a focus on things like road user charges. And look, as a parliamentarian, I'm very lucky. I get access to all sorts of people. I went to a briefing by the Norwegian ambassador as to how they tackled this and how they've managed to successfully, as an oil-producing nation, transition the bulk of their population across to electric vehicles. So just finally closing on infrastructure. Now, obviously, that's a big issue with lots of opportunity. So we shouldn't shy away from this. Everyone does think about charging stations. That's an obvious thing to talk about. Now, we are addressing that. As I mentioned before, we've got $250 million of federal funding now being allocated to 400 businesses, 50,000 households, and 1,000 public charging stations. So finally, we've got something happening there, and I have to say that's a good thing from the federal government. But there's also other issues like building codes. In trying to decide what sort of vehicle I was going to have, noting I had some difficulty because I do spend a lot of time out in northern South Australia. But even locally, my apartment building just doesn't offer the ability for me to have a charging station. And we need to have those designed into every new building because it's the future. It's going to be there. And the fact that we haven't got our building regulations cognizant of what will happen in the future, I think is a huge problem. Training. How do we train all the people up that need to maintain electric vehicles, which require a different set of skill sets to those mechanics and electricians, auto electricians that work on internal combustion engines? There's some of the things that we need to be thinking about also from an infrastructure perspective. So there we go. I've talked a little bit about ambition, or in some sense a lack of ambition. I've talked about some of the incentives and also talked about some of the infrastructure issues. And in that, I think I've discharged my brief from the association, but I understand there may be a bunch of questions that might get thrown at me. Anyway, that's short, relatively short and sweet for a politician.
That was fantastic, Rex. I was putting you down for at least another 10 minutes and being a politician, probably for another 20 and about 20 questions without notice. That was great, Rex, and it was short, sharp and succinct. I must admit I heard Senator Storer present the Senate committee report in Brisbane a few years ago, and I've just posted it in the chat room. A nice little checklist as we go to the voting booths to see how much of that's actually come true. So we spend all this money on a vision and say, here are the things we need to do. She's crickets. Unlike Travis Head, batting all day. Rex, normally it would be me that prattles on and asks a whole stack of questions, but as you probably know, the audience is very well heeled, and because they will ask questions, by all means throw them back to Dr. Chris Jones, because he was also right up there with the facts. Dr. Jones, will you unmute and read some of the phenomenal questions that people have sent without notice?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks, Senator Patrick, for your contribution. I'm speaking to you here from a classroom here at South Metropolitan TAFE in Munster, Western Australia. And it's interesting, Rex, we get a lot of Navy personnel coming through our training programs, learning electronics and that kind of stuff, and a lot of guys who wear the dolphins. So that's yeah, a bit of familiar territory there. Speaking from Wajak Noongar land, on the support and incentive side of things, a lot of people will reasonably draw the comparison to solar panels and the impact that they've had through subsidisation and support from government initiatives. And as a result, we've seen the cost of solar panels drop to, a fraction of a percent of what they were when they were first sort of produced on scale. Whilst I appreciate that battery electric vehicles won't enjoy perhaps the same kind of scale because they are a more complicated thing, I guess I'd like to sort of explore a bit more the nature of incentives and getting them right. I think we've seen opportunities for governments to provide incentives that often have perverse outcomes or unintended consequences. If a government was to offer some kind of financial incentive to buy an electric vehicle, what do you think it should look like, and how would you ensure that it was fair?
Well, again, and thank you for the question. Clearly, I identified in my opening address the fact that there are three tiers of government, and I think the answer to the question depends on which of those tiers we're referring to, whether that be in free parking, for example, at the council level, to registration or free registration at the state level, then through to road user charges at the national level. Look, when I spoke to the Norwegian ambassador, the Norwegians are sort of going through the process now of saying, how do we wind back some of the incentives? We've actually got a really, really good result. And I think they've actually decided that that they want to keep going a little bit longer. Now, to the detail of your question in terms of what is fair, where are the unintended consequences? As a politician, I've got to be careful about being prescriptive about what I might suggest. In fact, what we do is rely on experts. One of the reasons we have Senate inquiries is to call into the committee rooms people who manufacture charging stations, people who work on the technical aspects of plug standardization, or we have officials turning up talking about how they may levy charges and so forth, and they generally pop out with the answers. So I'm not an expert in these particular areas, but what I will say is we have to move forward with a coherent plan. We do have to understand what the unintended consequences are. We need to also make the investment. That's what Norway did, and I contrast some of the perhaps one of the problems I've seen with the Labor Party, and I don't mean to be political, but you can understand their philosophy. They say, why do we have incentives for electric vehicles when generally they're bought by people who are well off? And there's a Labor Party philosophy of making sure you assist those people that with government money that are perhaps below the medium income lines. And in some sense you can understand that argument, but you've got to look at the picture in totality. You've got to be able to be prepared to spend a bit of money to get to get ahead. We know that, for example, if we do start to get greater volumes with electric vehicles coming into the country, in actual fact, the unit prices will go down and help some of those people that aren't quite as well off as some of the Tesla drivers that I see driving around town. And we have to be able to factor all of that in, and we have to also contrast to spend on electric vehicle incentivification around things like JobKeeper, where the government simply gave away $13 billion of taxpayers' money to investors and company CEOs by way of bonuses for companies that simply did not need JobKeeper. $2.4 billion on a submarine project that has delivered almost nothing other than 5 years of national security delay. So I'd like to think that we can make an investment here, understanding the return on investment. So it's quite a long answer. I don't want to. Basically, what I'm saying is I'm not an expert on all of the individual matters, but we have to have a plan, and we have to talk all of these things through. And we have to do that about 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the analogy with solar panels is a fine example where, when they first came out, a solar array was $10,000 or more, and only the well-off households that could afford to do it did it. But within 10 years, it's actually the poorest postcodes in Australia that have some of the highest infiltrations of solar. So yes, there was that sort of fairness assessment that was perhaps made unfairly right back at the start, but we can see the impact, and I guess it just takes a bit of courage to make sure it works. I have a question here from John Fast, and he's asked, when do you feel is the right time to introduce road use taxes or fees, considering the current tiny percentage of EVs on the roads in Australia, and should we instead be thinking about penalising heavy polluters such as diesel passenger vehicles? Now, this is a subject that the AEVA has made a contribution to, and we've actually held the position for about the last 6 years, is that we don't actually have a problem with the idea of a road user charge, so long as it's low and it's spread fairly across all road users. So the introduction of a road user charge specifically for electric vehicles is certainly counterproductive in our view, but at the same time, we also see some merit in point of use application of collection of revenue on that front, because it kind of tempers the demand side of the equation as well. Do you think that there will be a federal appetite for this, whether it's from a change of government or the current one?
Look, okay, in terms of the fundamentals of the question, in terms of when is the right time, what I can say is not now. That's a definitive answer. Okay, and then we move forward and say when is the right time. Again, we have to use these mechanisms to get more vehicles into play here in Australia, more electric vehicles. I've just in the last 3 or 4 months passed legislation through the Senate, which I supported because I have a military background on fuel security, and basically doing a couple of things, spending taxpayers' money on subsidising refineries to make sure that we have fuel available here, and also to subsidise storage. Now, that's taxpayers' money being spent on fuels that support everyday transport. And you've got to look at this and say, every time I get an electric vehicle on the road, I now reduce my need for the storage of fuel. So there's a benefit that comes into play there, which if we capitalised on, would mean that we wouldn't have to spend the money on the storage. And so it's a really complicated question. You need to be able to, in some sense, model this. But again, the two things I'd say, the first thing I'll just repeat, not now, but I follow the lead of the Norwegian ambassador, who basically says right now they're several years into things, and they've got good uptake, and even they are shying away from changing the way in which electric vehicles are subsidised. So I don't know the answer other than not now.
Yeah. No, that's all fair. I think with the fuel security thing is something that's not discussed It really does surprise me that politicians who are normally quite happy to poke the bear, Peter Dutton in particular, they're not talking about the fact that we've only got about 2 weeks worth of fuel security on any given day, should there be a shut off of fuel supplies to Australia. So yeah, it's interesting that they'll talk tough in some areas, but they won't talk about that. So Wolfgang Rothman sends in a question here. He's asked, well, everyone's talking about EVs with a focus on cars, but electric 2- and 3-wheelers have been the unsung heroes of transport around the world. Australia's lagging very much so here. And he asks, is there an opportunity for incentives for 2- and 3-wheelers? And as a keen motorcyclist myself and a keen electric motorcyclist, I can definitely see that point. One of the reasons why I think electric motorcycles and scooters is a great idea is because they put virtually zero impact on the infrastructure. They take up substantially less space in our cities for parking, and they're an affordable EV that, you know, a lot of people, especially younger people, might be quite interested in jumping on. And I do note that in the various packages that have been released by state governments, motorcycles and scooters have been left out of those packages. If you've got any insight into why that might be the case, or any comments on electric 2-wheelers, yeah, do you have any views there?
Okay, so I'll play on each side of the coin here. Firstly, as a father, I always say to my daughters that if you're riding around on a scooter, you're probably going to be a temporary Australian because of all of those other people
still here.
driving cars. But so that's a worry I have about scooters and motorbikes. But look, I accept they're there, and whilst they're there, there is benefit again in shifting away from internal combustion engine scooters and motorcycles. And as such, we should apply the same principles as we do for regular passenger vehicles. And in actual fact, we should be doing the same thing in relation to buses and trucks and trying to move ourselves away from internal combustion cars. As I've talked about fuel security just immediately prior, but there's also a reduction in carbon emissions, which is something we're trying to achieve, and we could do that just by ensuring that we have more electric vehicles of whatever type on our roads. We understand the health benefits of not having monoxides coming out the back of exhaust pipes. There's all of these things that are really good about electric vehicles, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a truck, a car, or a motorbike or a train, for that matter. Although, in some respects, the longer haul and trains may well end up being hydrogen rather than strictly battery operated. But again, we need to embrace that.
It's interesting. I think heavy haulage, a lot of people will sort of shine a light on heavy haulage and say, oh, you're going to electrify that. What about road trains in the Pilbara? Are they surely going to be battery? Well, for a start, yes, they can be, but the batteries aren't there yet, but I'm sure they will be. But we always seem to forget the easy stuff, like, moving more freight on rail is it's something that just hasn't been discussed, and it's infrastructure. It's long haul, hotshot, and heavy haulage on rail is something that I think Australia has neglected for the last 50 years. And it has to be one of the easiest heavy haulage opportunities for electrification. You literally just put catenaries up. It's 100-year-old technology. I wonder, are Australians shying away from these really big infrastructure projects? And what can we do to change that?
Well, the difficulty there is that I don't think there's a lot of vision. I've just been out to Cooper Pedy, but I've been across the Eyre Peninsula in the last a few weeks, and there are so many things we could be doing, and it's not just about electric vehicles, but rail on the Eyre Peninsula it effectively shut down a few years ago, and now we have something like 30,000 more truck movements on very narrow and ill-maintained roads. And I would love to see us go back to rail for hauling grain, for hauling iron ore around that area, and indeed have it electric as well. Again, it just seems to me like there's no coordinated plan. As we approach this election, it worries me, because we also don't have an ICAC, federal ICAC.
Who would get the funding to build it?
Yes, that some of these, this planning depends on, what gets funded doesn't depend on some national integrated plan for Australia, but the colour code of red and blue on a spreadsheet, where marginal seats get things and other safe seats don't get anything at all. There's just so many problems in my view. Again, because we don't have an integrated plan. Now, things can be really, really complex. So you've got a whole bunch of systems on systems, but in the electric vehicle space, where's the national strategy for that? It's just not there. So it goes back to what I said before. If you don't plan, I guess there's no objectives that we can hold the government to, and that really is a problem, and it's something that worries me dearly, not just on electric vehicles, but right across the spectrum in terms of the future of Australia and the future of our kids. I've been involved in some Senate inquiries over the last couple of weeks to do with manufacturing, and I look at the Singapore Economic Development Board, who they say, Singapore now needs to have an electronics industry. The government will invest in that. The government will co-invest. They don't give grants away. They say, let's buy into business propositions with a buyout time and a buyout price, and away they go. But it's all part of a strategy where they, when Singapore first became independent from Malaysia, they had low skills, and so the government struck up basket weaving as an industry, and then they moved to education, and then they moved to from where they were back then now to advanced manufacturing now. They don't pay people to skill up from basket weaving. When I was up there a couple of years ago, they were paying something like 150 PhDs to travel around the world, do studies with an obligation to return to Singapore, and then contribite to the future of Singapore. And Singapore is the size of the ACT with 1/3 of Australia's GDP. And it's because they plan and they think things through, not afraid of picking winners, and they're just smart about how they do things. And I'm disappointed by what happens here in Australia, but I do try. I'm in there trying to poke and prod in relation to this, because it's really important.
Well, it's about priorities, and as someone has just noted, that $9 billion worth of our money goes towards supporting the fossil fuel industry in some way, shape, or form. Here in my home state of Western Australia, our state government has an appalling record on addressing climate change. They can legitimately say that, we're putting forward all of these initiatives, like, we're going to stop logging the forests in the southwest, and we're going to install a charging network for EVs, which is great. But then in a stroke of a pen, they approve a gas extraction plant that will release what is effectively a carbon dioxide bomb on the world. And that doesn't seem to get talked about. And you mentioned earlier about an ICAC. Well, I think Woodside's got some tabs on politicians here in the West, and they have a huge amount of clout. So on the subject of big infrastructure projects, I recall reading that the Snowy Hydro scheme, when built, I think they completed it in the early 70s. And at that point, they'd spent the equivalent of something like about $13 billion on it in today's money. What would that same scale project look like today, and how much would it cost? And would we get the value for money? So how I think the federal government could organise how those contracts are awarded certainly could save us a lot of money if they did it well.
Well, can I just comment on that, because they might say how well might we do it if we did it again? Well, we do have Snowy 2.0 on the books that Australian taxpayers are paying for, and I might point out that at a recent Senate estimates, because I've been harping on about Australian steel, Snowy Hydro conceded that that 70% of their steelwork is going to come from Austria, and yeah, that just really frustrates me. And part, there were some reasons that sit behind that. That simply Snowy Hydro didn't. They just accepted what their Italian sort of partner indicated in terms of this is the length of steel. I think it was something like 13 metres. In Australia, we can only do 10 metre long piping sections. So instead of upgrading the Australian capability or saying we'll happily accept more welds along the way, they simply they're just contracting, exporting our money and our jobs overseas. So I mean, there is a frustration with Snowy Hydro, and I'll just go back to things like the Beetaloo Basin and some of the other projects that that are looking to increase the amount of gas that we're producing. Can I just say, we produce far more gas than we ever need. The problem is all of the cheap gas is exported. That harms our manufacturing industry that end up paying the more expensive price. But the bizarre thing is, as we're talking about trying to claw back little bits of money in terms of road user charges for electric vehicles, we're spending all of this money on a gas industry that will likely collapse faster than most people think as the world moves towards renewable energy. And I've said this in the Parliament. I think I've said it outside the Parliament as well. The dumbest idea for 2021 goes to the National Party, who said we want to have $250 billion of taxpayers' money set aside to be able to fund the projects that the banks won't touch. I mean, that is the dumbest idea for 2021.
The party of fiscal management.
Yes, exactly. So, look, there's frustration there. So, the relevance of this to an electric vehicle discussion is because most people who are buying electric vehicles and using electric vehicles are generally very responsible from a climate change perspective. We watch these other projects where there's huge amounts of taxpayers' money being spent. So the quantum far greater than what needs to be spent to ramp up and move us away from the very products that they're looking to dig out of the ground.
On the subject of value add and digging stuff out of the ground, here at South Metro TAFE, we recently had the Future Battery Industries Cooperative Research Centre partner with TAFE to work out the skills gap, the big vocational skills gaps in this new energy economy that is about to hit us over the head. And their argument is, look, there's not only a buck to be made, there's trillions of bucks to be made if we exploit the mineral resources that we've got for battery technology and all of the steps along the way. And there was a realization that there wasn't the skills that we needed to pull that off. So advanced manufacturing, right down to people who can service your EV. I took my electric car to the dealership where I bought it and said, oh, the heater stopped working. It's a car, things go wrong. And it took the long-winded process of about 6 weeks or 8 weeks to get it repaired because they needed the right trained staff to come in on that day to do it. Are we seeing any signs at the federal level, but we're certainly seeing some signs at the state level of funding for training in this new energy economy? And I personally think that would be money well spent. Would you agree?
Oh, look, absolutely. again, we spend our money on the wrong things. I voted against some recent increases in charges for students going to universities, where the government in effect is trying to architect what sort of degrees that students get, thinking that they can just force everyone into STEM, when lots of kids are not STEM minded. I think there are some problems in that space, and that need to be resolved. In TAFE, I think we've got this massive problem where everyone goes off and does degrees, and we then don't have people doing trades. I'm actually an electronic technician. I think if I'm not in the Senate next time around, I'll probably end up making more money as a relatively experienced electronic technician, but. I was pleased to hear that the Labor Party announced the other day that they would go down the pathway of having free TAFE training, and I think that's a significant policy announcement. We have such a skills shortage, not just in industries related to the energy sector, but across a whole range of fields, and. One of the ways in which we used to resolve that was by way of immigration, and I was firmly in favour of immigration, bringing skilled people, particularly to regions where we didn't have those skills, to enable businesses to get on and do things. COVID has stopped that immigration, and there's just a huge hole. And again, it goes back to a lack of forward planning, even in relation to naval shipbuilding. Here in South Australia, where we've had programs on record for some considerable period of time, the government has just done a woeful job of making sure we've got the right skills in place. I am very worried about that lack of skill. But again, in terms of a nation-building program, stop exporting rocks, stop exporting lithium. There are 5 stages of processing in the lithium chain, and that's not including how you deal with recycled batteries, which is a huge opportunity.
Massive, yeah.
But in order to do that, you have to sort of commit and really invest in that area. And I know that the difference between the exporting of lithium and the exporting and the importing of lithium batteries is of a similar sort of differential between what I talked about with titanium. That to me, huge opportunity being lost, but again, just a lack of planning. Too many politicians sitting in Canberra trying to work out how they're going to get re-elected rather than governing the country.
On the subject of recycling batteries, an interesting point that I learned from one of our members who is a metal recycler here in Perth, he said it actually costs him money to deal with lithium-ion batteries. They sort them into alkaline lithium-ion, but to render them safe enough to transport to the other side of the country where they're processed by, I think it was EnviroStream, was one of the handful of companies doing it. That costs money. So not only are we throwing away or exporting a resource from within our state, what they do when they get to Victoria is they shred it up and they send that black stuff to Korea to be turned back into batteries. I mean, it's we will very quickly find that we have no choice but to recycle our own batteries here in Australia because it's a hazard to export from a fire risk as well. So I think that'll be one of the industries that will pick up quite rapidly, simply because there's money to be made in it. It's a valuable resource that we really shouldn't be disposing of unthoughtfully. John, did you have any further questions you wanted to follow up with? I thought I'd give someone else a go.
Thanks, Chris. I just hope I can read them as eloquently as you can answer them. Of course, you mentioned Wolfgang Rothman before because he's talking about EVs and everybody's talking about cars and trains. And isn't it great to see the comment about why are we still flying from Melbourne to Sydney when it takes an hour to get to the airport, an hour to check in, an hour to fly, and an hour to get off the plane in Sydney and go somewhere, when a high-speed train, let's not go there, but it could be electric, I wonder if the train route's still there. Maybe would have dug it up 100 years ago and they'll put it back in again. I suppose, Rex, there's one question here that sounds like a flagrant sales pitch, which I love. And it's from Gordon. It's from Gordon Land. So I'm going to answer the question by saying, can I give him your email address? Because he has patented with the World International Patent Body. And what does it say here? I patented a practical method to catch residual energy from an armature of electric motor and cycle back to the supply battery system as such way to extend the runtime of battery system without effectively drawing up extra power from the battery. I ask us why we bring clever Australians in when they're actually sitting in this webinar. So his question is, and it's not that much of a question, but it's a good one. Maybe the Senator can help to liaise and foster this Australia First invention to industrial scale to benefit the world. It sounds like the solar heart or the snap-in beer keg. We have to license it everywhere in the world and bring it back. Rex, just to facilitate that question for Gordon, should he not? Who does he approach?
Yeah, look, it's a problem that we have, and I've looked at some programs, even advocated some programs to the industry minister. We have a lot of people that come out of universities that when they're doing a PhD or some sort of postgraduate degree, they come up with some fantastic ideas. They just don't have the ability to transform that idea into from a prototype to a product, and then be able to market that. There's not a lot of support for that. If you have a product that has moved advanced down a prototype pathway, you might be able to get investors come in, but there's a gap between the sort of nascent product and something that where investors will back a product. It's a huge problem for us, and one of the difficulties is you can rock up and say, well, I want to get a grant, and you might have all the right sort of ideas and prospects available that would otherwise get you a grant, but then they say, but you know what, you've got to have skin in the game as well. You've got to have 50%. We'll give you the other 50%. Now, people say, well, it's a $100,000 grant. I don't have $100,000, or it's $1 million grant. I don't have $1 million to put in to co-invest.
Yeah.
So there's a huge problem that exists between that sort of idea that pops up that's patentable and the transforming that into something where venture capitalists will take it, help you take it to the world. And I have had discussions with the minister about how that might be done. I even got to the stage of almost proposing a program that they were going to sponsor. So it's a huge problem, and we have to find an answer to it.
I believe that the federal government just recently announced that they were going to offer some sizable number of hundreds of millions of dollars to universities specifically for commercializing research or commercializable research, which all sounds great, except it's a bit galling considering that they let the sector down so comprehensively during COVID. But yeah, I think there is definitely an appetite for improved management of intellectual property that's generated here in Australia.
Can I just say that if you go and look at the statistics of where Australia sits in terms of the number of patents that are obtained, we are way down the list, way down from where we should be. And look, I'm not even convinced, and I don't want to be offensive in saying this, I'm not convinced necessarily giving universities money to commercialise is necessarily a good idea, because a lot of times in universities you have people who are really, really good at developing those ideas, but don't have the commercialisation skills. And again, that's not being disrespectful to those very, very smart people that might manage a PhD student or guide people through the development of fantastic new ideas. It can take someone who's got an idea. When I used to run an R&D cell. I used to have engineers, really smart engineers, coming in and say, Rex, got this great idea. And so we're going to have to park that because I've got no market for it. I've got no ability to monetize that particular idea. And it might be because I can't identify a customer. But when I did have a customer that was where I could say, I can take that to a customer, I can get someone interested in that. You've got to have a team of very experienced people. So for example, you have to have production engineers involved in turning a prototype into something more, because you don't want to get to a situation where you've got a great prototype, but you can't build it effectively, efficiently, or to a particular standard every single time. So it's a complicated task, and I don't think necessarily that universities have all the right skills to be able to do that.
Very good answer. I think you also nailed it before. Gordon, how's Singapore looking? But you did actually nail it before, Rex, that if we don't have a department that single-handedly, bloody-mindedly looks at good ideas and is able to channel people quickly to where they need to go to get to commercialization, then yeah, we're a sinking ship. The only upside, of course, is that the CSIRO have nailed a couple of multi-$100 million inventions recently too. And I'll just put a shameless plug there, Gordon. April 1, 2, and 3 next year, all of the Australian manufacturers of EVs will be at the annual conference and expo in the ACT. So bring the patent, bring your ideas, and we can introduce you to everyone that's worth talking to. Rex, I'm only joking. I'm not really going to give Gordon your email address, but Gordon, you can always get one of ours.
It's on the web. It's okay.
Yeah. And Rex will buy shares, but of course there are, if you Googled innovation funds in Australia, there's way more than there used to be. And there are lots of venture capitalists looking at that green technology. And it's funny that I've heard Australia has one of the highest rates of startups still in Australia. So,
well, I think COVID resulted in a whole bunch of people with money to spend, but nothing to spend it on, with it banks offering lousy returns on savings. So people are keen to invest in potentially risky, but potentially amazing products and developments.
One of the problems with government, and you can kind of get there's almost a justification for this, is governments don't like to invest in something where actually the project fails. And that can sometimes happen with new ideas. But I think we have to train our governments to be able to manage things. So they've got large projects being managed by very experienced people, and they've got R&D companies that are doing work on developing products. But some money can go to projects where there's a risk of complete failure. You've got to manage that. You've got to balance that out, just as you would inside a company. But it is possible, but it takes a change in mindset.
Yeah, great answer. So, there's a whole stack of questions. One of the ones that I had was, if you were the Prime Minister, how would you and what would you do first? When I first attended the first AEVA National Conference and Expo, a gentleman got up and banged up a slide, presentation 1, and it had the world's logos on it. Google, Apple, you name it, it was all on there. Thank goodness it wasn't on the ABC. And he said, and I quote, "It doesn't matter what your government says, these companies will make this happen." So, 2 years later, we're in Sydney in an autonomous vehicle getting driven around Olympic Village. And it was already a life-size thing. So maybe these things that we're talking about will happen despite the government, not because of the government.
Well, can I just say that the difficulty I have with that is we are seeing charging infrastructure being funded, and that's a good thing, but it's not coherent. Let me give just a simple example. If the government came out and said, it is now government policy that by 2030, 2035, pick the date, we will not be having ICE vehicles being imported into this country, except for the special circumstances. There might be some circumstances where you might have an exemption to that. If you did that, almost immediately, all state governments, all building manufacturers would then start to think about charging stations inside apartments. So government providing a strategy. So if I'm going to be the Prime Minister for a day, I actually don't really want that. I would never want that job. There's too much compromise you have to do to get to a point where you're the Prime Minister. So just make me a king for a day. What I would do is release the strategy, release the national strategy, because that will drive a whole bunch of other things that will then just flow from that strategy being out there and in place.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. We've certainly advocated for federal leadership on this, whether it's emission standards for vehicles that basically forces manufacturers to develop their EVs at an affordable rate and sell them into the Australian market, which is largely considered a difficult market for automakers anyway. But yeah, you're right. If the leadership paints the horizon, then people will know where to walk.
Yeah.
Senator Patrick, I can see that it's 7:32 and probably 1957 still in WA. I think you've brought it to a great point that mutual and intelligent conversations are certainly one part of this formula moving forward. The building code doesn't need looking at. We've had about 6 comments about that. I personally have never felt comfortable talking about any matters of national security, least of all while anybody's listening to how much fuel we do or don't have, especially not if we're going to boycott things in China. I look forward to the day that we have 47 independent Rex Patrick type people who are specialists in their industries leading our country. And I think we should separate infrastructure from government decisions and leave it in the hands of experts. I do offer thoughts and prayers for the jobs and growth with the can-do capitalism. But I think, as we all know, we have to switch the fleets first: council, state government, federal government, and we should all, like you, Senator Patrick, grab an E and go and do some burnouts on the lawn at Parliament, just so people know it's happening. We thank you for your time. I look forward to seeing Richard Dennis and Greg McGarvey and some of the other manufacturers in these sessions. We're expecting presentations from a number of other political leaders, but I'm so glad you went first, Senator Patrick, and thank you so much. Did you want to wrap up? And
I just want to give you a final piece of advice before I depart, okay. That is to say that we are 6 months away from a federal election. That means we are in the time frame where people have the most democratic power that they will ever get, and utilize that to try and get commitments, to try and get changes, because after an election, your influence is substantially less. And I say that as a collective. Exploit the next six months.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Write to your MP. Everybody has an MP. Write to them and say, what is your position on EVs, on the energy transition, on skills gaps, and how we're going to address them. If you don't write to your MP, they'll just assume that you're happy with what they're doing.
Yep. The 1,260 people who are lobbyists walking the aisles of Parliament clearly carry more power than most of us. And I think you're dead right there, Chris. It's all about making ourselves heard. A shameless plug for those who aren't members of the Australian Electric Vehicle Association, it is only $50 to join, $25 for concession, $125 for corporates. A reminder to lock the 1st, 2nd and 3rd of April in your diary. 2022 will be in Canberra with a plane, no doubt. There'll be an electric plane there. The service will probably exist by then for you, Rex, to travel from Canberra to South Australia, not Whyalla. That's just one range anxiety none of us want to have. There's lots of thanks coming in on this session, and we look forward to more sessions with you in the future. We'll definitely get you back, Senator. That was just phenomenal. Thank you, President Jones. Thank you to the IT and technical people, and thanks to Mark Baker, your assistant, Senator Patrick, for making this happen. Have a great night, everybody, and charge well.